Training a foundation model requires a staggering concentration of physical resources. It demands massive server farms, thousands of processors, and vast electrical energy. Under the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act, different foundation models carry vastly different regulatory burdens. The regulation focuses heavily on a specific tier of systems, those possessing capabilities so broad and powerful that they pose a systemic risk to society. Chapter 19 of the regulation is engineered specifically to contain these ultra-powerful systems. To understand this framework, we have to look at the mathematical threshold that triggers it, the strict notification protocol that follows, the 4 absolute legal obligations imposed, and the pathways for proving compliance. While standard general-purpose models face a baseline of transparency requirements, systemic risk models are subjected to a reinforced regime of active mitigation and intense regulatory oversight. To decide who falls into this higher tier, European regulators tied legal liability directly to the raw computational scale required to build the model. In the eyes of the AI Act, the scale of the engine dictates the intensity of the regulatory inspection. Article 51 outlines exactly how a model is classified as a systemic risk. This diagram shows the 2 distinct routes for classification. The primary route is a hard, quantitative presumption based on the cumulative computational power utilized during the model's training phase. The statutory metric is set at 10 to the 25th floating point operations, or flops. Any model that requires more computing power than this specific mathematical boundary is legally presumed to possess high-impact capabilities. Because hardware and training techniques evolve rapidly, the European Commission retains the authority to adjust this threshold as technology advances. The secondary pathway relies on direct regulatory intervention rather than a mathematical formula. The Commission can proactively designate a model as a systemic risk if it meets specific qualitative criteria, even if its training compute fell short of the 10 to the 25th threshold. This qualitative trigger is guided by a scientific panel of independent experts who monitor the industry and alert the Commission to emerging technical threats. By establishing these routes, the European Union has pinned the definition of power to specific, measurable engineering milestones. Crossing that computational boundary functions as an immediate legal trigger. Under Article 52, the provider has exactly 2 weeks from the moment their model crosses the threshold to formally notify the European Commission. The legal status at this 2-week mark is a rebuttable presumption of risk rather than a final verdict. During this tight window, the provider has the right to launch a formal rebuttal process. They can present technical evidence to prove that, despite utilizing massive compute power, their specific model does not actually pose a systemic threat. If those arguments fail to convince the Commission, the model officially enters the systemic risk regime. The compute threshold shifts the burden of proof, requiring the tech company to prove their system is safe, instead of requiring the regulator to prove it is dangerous. Once classified, the model falls under Article 55. This is the bedrock of the systemic risk regime, containing 4 reinforced obligations. The first obligation demands rigorous, standardized model evaluation. This requirement necessitates mandatory red teaming, where the provider actively attacks their own system to expose technical vulnerabilities before deployment. The second obligation focuses on active risk mitigation. Providers are required to continuously assess their models, trace potential systemic risks back to their origins, and mitigate them across the entire union. The third obligation deals with incident reporting. Providers must track serious incidents and report them directly to the AI office, without delay, detailing the exact corrective measures taken. The fourth and final obligation mandates strict cybersecurity standards. This requirement protects both the model's software environment and the physical hardware infrastructure where it is trained. These 4 pillars represent hard, unyielding statutory law, absolute requirements that cannot be bypassed. This raises an immediate operational question. How does a provider actually prove to regulators that they have met the dense technical demands of Article 55? The answer is found in Article 56, establishing the relationship between mandatory law and the codes of practice. The code is a flexible instrument drawn up at the union level, integrating direct technical input from stakeholders and model providers. The very first general-purpose AI code of practice was finalized and approved in the summer of 2025. The legal distinction between these two articles is critical. Article 55 is mandatory, while Article 56 is a voluntary pathway. Following the Code of Practice grants a presumption of conformity, providing an agreed-upon shortcut to prove the provider has met the legal standard. Providers who choose to ignore the Code of Practice face a much higher burden of evidence. Skipping the code means the provider must invent, thoroughly document, and independently defend their own alternative methods to satisfy the bedrock requirements. Ultimately, the Code of Practice provides the standardized, agreed-upon pathway for companies attempting to clear these high legal hurdles. The sequence laid out in Chapter 19 operates with mechanical precision. Scaling compute triggers classification, forces rapid notification, and activates mandatory mitigation protocols. The red line for the industry currently stands at 10 to the 25th floating point operations. This framework ensures that no private entity can deploy massive computational capabilities without facing an equivalent measure of public oversight. For tech lawyers and CTOs, the architecture of a foundation model now dictates its legal liability. Ultimately, within the European Union, raw computational power has now become the absolute primary yardstick of a company's legal responsibility.